I suppose it started on that Wednesday in March, one of those raw, late winter evenings when the shop smells particularly sweet against the chill outside. I was finishing a wedding consultation, arranging sample centerpieces of blush ranunculus and white anemones for a June bride. The bell above the door jingled just as I was closing, and there he was, tall, rain-spattered, looking utterly lost among the buckets of flowers. The violet lantern has always been my sanctuary, with its stained glass lamps casting pools of amber light across the wooden floors. But that night, it felt like a stage set for something I couldn't yet name. "I'm sorry," he said, running a hand through his damp hair. "I know you're closing, but I'm in a bind." Up close, I could see the exhaustion etched around his eyes. Striking green eyes, the color of river moss in sunlight. He couldn't have been much older than 35, with a weathered quality to his face that spoke of time spent outdoors rather than years lived. "My grandmother passed away this morning," he continued, his voice surprisingly soft for someone with such a rugged appearance. "The memorial's tomorrow, and I just flew in. I should have called ahead for flowers, but it's been—" His hands were trembling slightly, and I recognized that particular hollowness of fresh grief. Without thinking, I set aside the bride's sample and motioned toward the small sitting area where I usually discuss arrangements with clients. "Sit," I told him. "I'll make tea." He looked startled, then grateful in a way that made my chest tighten. "You don't have to—" "Chamomile or Earl Grey?" I asked, already moving toward the electric kettle I keep behind the counter. "Chamomile," he answered after a moment. "Thank you." We sat across from each other, steam rising between us, and he told me about his grandmother, Elaine, who had raised him after his parents died in a car accident when he was 11. How she'd taught him to identify birds by their calls, to respect the wilderness, to find solace in silence. He was a cinematographer for nature documentaries, just back from filming in Alaska. His name was Bryce Keller, and he spoke with his whole body, lean hands sketching shapes in the air as he described his grandmother's garden, the way she could coax blooms from even the most stubborn plants. "She sounds like my kind of woman," I said, and his smile then, a real one that reached his eyes, changed something in the air between us. We talked for nearly 2 hours. I found myself telling him about my divorce 3 years earlier, how Thomas and I had simply drifted into separate orbits until one day we realized we were strangers sharing a house. No drama, no betrayal, just the quiet tragedy of growing apart. I told Bryce about buying this shop when I was 28, how I'd built the Violet Lantern into something that felt like an extension of myself. I even mentioned Whitman, my temperamental Persian cat named after my favorite poet. When I finally glanced at the clock, it was nearly 10. I hadn't stayed this late at the shop in years, hadn't lost track of time in conversation, since I couldn't remember when. "Oh God, I've kept you forever," he said, looking mortified when he noticed the time. "It's fine," I assured him, surprised to find I meant it. "But we should probably talk about your grandmother's flowers before we close down local history and literature completely." We settled on a mixture of blue hydrangeas, for gratitude and understanding, white roses for remembrance, and sprigs of rosemary for memory. As I wrote up the order, I was acutely aware of him watching my hands. My fingers aren't what they used to be. Hints of arthritis have begun to knot my knuckles, but they're strong and capable from years of cutting stems and stripping thorns. "I'll have it ready by 9 tomorrow," I told him, sliding the order form across the counter. "Will you be picking it up, or should I arrange delivery to the funeral home?" "I'll come by," he said, and there was a momentary hesitation in his voice that made me look up. "Thank you for this, for all of it. I came in expecting to grab whatever was available, and instead, you got trapped by a chatty florist." I finished for him, suddenly self-conscious about how much I'd shared with a complete stranger. "Instead, I found exactly what I needed," he corrected quietly. After he left, I locked up and walked the 6 blocks home to my cottage, the spring night cool against my skin. My garden was just beginning to wake up, daffodils nodding their golden heads in the light of the street lamps. I should have felt tired. It had been a long day. But instead, I felt oddly alert, as if my nerve endings were more sensitive than usual. Whitman greeted me with his customary disdain, turned to quick affection once he realized I was alone, winding between my ankles as I heated leftover soup. I told myself it was nothing, a momentary connection with a kind stranger, the sort of intensified intimacy that sometimes happens in the face of grief. I'd experienced it before with clients planning funeral arrangements, that temporary closeness born of shared vulnerability. By morning, the strange resonance I'd felt with Bryce Keller would fade. Except it didn't. He arrived at 9 o'clock sharp the next morning, dressed in a charcoal suit that looked borrowed or rarely worn, hair still damp from the shower. I had his grandmother's arrangement waiting, the blues and whites elegant against the dark green foliage. "It's perfect," he said, touching one of the hydrangea blooms with careful fingers. "She would have loved this." "I hope it brings some comfort today," I replied. Professional again, last night's unusual openness tucked away where it belonged. He paid, thanked me again, and left with the arrangement cradled in his arms like something precious. I watched him go, telling myself that was the end of a brief, meaningful encounter, the kind that enriches your life for a moment before dissolving back into the everyday. I was wrong. A week later, he returned, pushing through the door just before closing time again. I was alone in the shop, trimming the stems of fresh tulips for the next day's display. "You're making this a habit," I said before I could stop myself. He smiled, that genuine smile that transformed his face, and pulled out his phone. "I wanted to show you something." The photo he showed me caught me off guard. My arrangement, the blue hydrangeas vibrant against the green backdrop of what looked like a mountain trail, with a waterfall misting in the background. "My grandmother loved the Blue Ridge Parkway," he explained. "There's this waterfall trail she used to take me to when I was a kid, Crabtree Falls. I hiked up after the memorial and left some of the flowers there. It felt right." I stared at the image, unexpectedly moved. In 15 years of creating funeral arrangements, no one had ever returned to show me where the flowers had ended up, what they had meant beyond the ceremony itself. "Thank you for showing me," I managed to say, my professional demeanor slipping again. "Actually," he said, sliding his phone back into his pocket, "I was wondering if you'd let me thank you properly. There's a small hike near here. Nothing strenuous, just a mile or so to a really beautiful overlook. The wildflowers are starting to bloom, and I thought someone who knows as much about flowers as you might enjoy seeing them in their natural habitat." I must have looked startled because he immediately backtracked. "Or not. I realize that might sound strange. We barely know each other, and you probably have plans this weekend." "Yes," I interrupted, surprising myself. "I'd like that." That first hike to Craggy Gardens became 2, then 3, then weekly excursions into the mountains surrounding Asheville. Spring unfurled around us as we wandered trails lined with trillium and wild geranium, Bryce pointing out birds I'd never noticed before. The flash of a scarlet tanager, the distinctive call of a wood thrush at dusk. I showed him how Queen Anne's lace and wild carrot could be distinguished only by the tiny purple flower at the center of the latter, how mountain laurel blooms looked like tiny origami when examined up close. We kept our hikes to public trails, our conversations mostly focused on the natural world around us. There was nothing inappropriate about our outings, just two people sharing knowledge, appreciating beauty. But I found myself selecting my hiking clothes with unusual care, applying a touch of the coral lipstick I usually reserved for dinner with friends. At 50, I knew better than to read too much into his attention. I was a local business owner who had shown him kindness during a difficult time. He was a younger man temporarily grounded in Asheville while sorting through his grandmother's affairs, until the day it rained, a sudden spring downpour that caught us halfway up the trail to Looking Glass Rock. We huddled under a rocky overhang, watching sheets of water transform the forest into something primeval and mysterious. Bryce had brought coffee in a thermos, and we passed it back and forth, shoulders touching in the small dry space. "I got a call yesterday," he said, his voice almost lost in the drumming of rain on leaves. "The production company wants me in Montana next month for a project on wolverines." "Oh," I said, feeling a disproportionate sense of loss. "That's wonderful. How long will you be gone?" 4 months, maybe longer if we get the footage we need." He turned to look at me, raindrops clinging to his eyelashes. I've been thinking about turning it down. Why would you do that? I asked, genuinely puzzled. From everything he'd told me, these assignments were coveted, his passion. Because I've never felt as grounded anywhere as I have these past few weeks in Asheville. His eyes held mine. Because I've never met anyone like you, Clarissa. The rain seemed to grow louder in that moment, filling the silence between us as I struggled to find words. I'm 50 years old, Bryce, I finally said, the obvious fact somehow serving as shorthand for all the reasons his words couldn't mean what they seemed to. Ah, I know how old you are, he replied quietly. I'm 31. Neither fact seems particularly relevant to how I feel when I'm with you. My heart was hammering against my ribs. And how is that? Like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. Like I can see things more clearly. Like I want to know everything about you. What makes you laugh? What keeps you up at night? Why you decided to specialize in flowers that speak when people can't find the words. He took a breath. I'm not naive, Clarissa. I know what people would think. I know what you're probably thinking. But I've spent my life watching and waiting for the perfect moments, those rare interactions in nature that tell a whole story in seconds. I know one when I see it. The rain began to ease, sunlight filtering through the trees in slanted beams. I thought about my tidy life, my cottage with its garden, my shop with its routines, the careful patterns I'd established after my marriage ended, the safety of it, the loneliness of it, too. I don't know what to say, I admitted. You don't have to say anything right now, he said. But don't say no just because you think you should. Don't say no because of numbers that don't matter to me. We hiked back down the mountain in companionable silence, the forest steam-cleaned and glistening around us. At my car, he hesitated, then leaned in and pressed a kiss to my cheek, his lips warm against my rain-cooled skin. Think about it, he said. I'll be at the coffee shop on Lexington tomorrow at 2 if you want to talk. If not, I understand. I drove home in a daze, my cheek tingling where his lips had touched it. Whitman greeted me at the door, complaining loudly about his dinner being late. I fed him mechanically, then stood in my shower for a long time, letting hot water wash away the mud and confusion of the day. That night, I couldn't sleep. I paced through my cottage, touching the familiar objects that defined my life. Books well-loved and dog-eared, the antique piano I played less often than I should, photographs of my parents, my sister, and her children, friends gathered at my annual garden party. No pictures of Thomas remained. We divided those evenly in the divorce, another example of our civilized parting. My life looked exactly as I'd designed it to be. Elegant, organized, peaceful, and suddenly, terribly insufficient. I went to the coffee shop the next day. Bryce was already there, sitting by the window, a book open in front of him. He looked up when the bell above the door jingled, and the naked hope on his face made my breath catch. I've been thinking, I said, sliding into the chair across from him. And I'm scared, I admitted. Not of what people might think, though God knows Asheville will talk, but of what happens when you realize that the age difference does matter. When you want children, or when my body starts to really show its years, or when— Clarissa, he interrupted gently. I've never wanted children. I've spent my entire adult life traveling to the most remote places on Earth to film animals that most people will never see in person. I've slept in tents for months at a time. My longest relationship ended because she couldn't understand why I'd choose mud and mosquitoes over a normal life in the suburbs. And what happens when your work calls you away again? I asked. What am I supposed to do? Wait here like some 1950s housewife while you're off having adventures? He smiled then, a slow smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. Come with me. I stared at him. What? And not all the time, if you don't want to. But sometimes. Your shop has that talented assistant manager, Sophie, right? She's been running things when you're not there anyway. You could take extended trips, see the places I'm always talking about. His eyes were bright with excitement. Or I could base myself here between assignments, take fewer jobs, be more selective. I've been thinking about writing, maybe teaching workshops on nature photography. There are options, Clarissa, if we want there to be. You've thought about this, I said, somewhat dazed. Hasa every day since I walked into your shop, he admitted. Every hike, every conversation, I've been trying to figure out how to tell you that I think we could build something real. We talked for hours that afternoon. Cold coffee forgotten between us. About practical things. My business, his nomadic lifestyle, the logistics of a relationship with someone who might be gone for months at a time. About deeper fears. My worry that his attraction was some kind of mother figure complex. His concern that I might always be waiting for him to leave for someone younger. We talked until the baristas began wiping down tables around us, the clear signal that closing time approached. Have dinner with me tonight, he said as we finally stood to leave. At a real restaurant, not a coffee shop or a mountain trail. Let me take you on an actual date. That night, at a small farm-to-table restaurant tucked away on a side street in the River Arts District, Bryce held my chair and ordered a bottle of Pinot Noir that complemented my salmon perfectly. We talked about books. He loved Steinbeck. I preferred Woolf. And music. His taste ran to folk and bluegrass, while I remained devoted to classical. Under the soft lighting, with the murmur of conversation around us, it felt startlingly, wonderfully normal. Until we stepped outside, and he kissed me properly for the first time, his hands framing my face with a gentleness that made my knees weak. I hadn't been kissed like that in decades, maybe ever, with such focused attention, as if memorizing the moment was as important as the sensation itself. I should go, I whispered, when we finally broke apart, acutely aware that we were standing on a public sidewalk, that anyone walking by could see us. Can I see you tomorrow? He asked, his thumbs brushing my cheekbones. I have the shop in the morning, but I'm free after 2, I said, feeling like I was stepping off a cliff into open air. The next weeks passed in a blur of discovery. Bryce came to my cottage for the first time, charming Whitman immediately in a betrayal I pretended outrage over. He cooked dinner for me, a surprisingly sophisticated risotto with wild mushrooms he'd foraged himself. We sat on my porch swing afterward, talking until the fireflies emerged, twinkling in the garden like earthbound stars. We hiked more challenging trails, Bryce patient with my slower pace on steep inclines. We visited galleries in the River Arts District, debating the merits of different painters over gelato from a tiny shop by the French Broad River. He helped me repaint my kitchen the warm terracotta color I'd been considering for years, but never committed to. And yes, we became lovers. I won't pretend I wasn't terrified the first time I let him see me naked in daylight. At 50, my body bears the marks of its journey, the slight softening around my middle, the silver stretch marks on my hips from weight fluctuations over the years, the beginnings of that crepey texture on my neck that no amount of expensive cream seems to forestall. I've never been someone who could be called beautiful, striking perhaps, with my high cheekbones and tall frame, but not beautiful in that conventional way that turns heads. But Bryce looked at me as if I were some rare flower he'd spent years searching for in remote valleys. He traced the curves of my body with reverence, kissed every place I might have hidden, told me I was gorgeous with such conviction that I began, improbably, to believe him. In his arms, I remembered how it felt to be fully present in my own skin, to receive pleasure without self-consciousness, to give it without reservation. Our relationship wasn't without complications. Sophie, my assistant manager, raised an eyebrow the first time Bryce dropped me off at the shop, but said nothing beyond, "He seems nice." My sister Jennifer was less tactful when I finally told her, spewing concerns about gold diggers and midlife crises over the phone from Charlotte. My few close friends were divided, half romantic enough to be charmed by the unlikely pairing, half practical enough to worry. The first time we ran into Thomas at the farmer's market was excruciating. My ex-husband's double-take would have been comical in any other context, his eyes moving from my face to Bryce's and back again, confusion followed by comprehension, and something like pity crossing his features. He was polite in that strained way, peculiar to uncomfortable encounters, introducing his new girlfriend, younger than him, but not dramatically so, and making small talk about the heirloom tomatoes. Afterward, I was quiet on the drive home, wondering if I looked as pathetic to outsiders as Thomas clearly thought I did. A middle-aged woman clinging to youth through a younger man. "Talk to me," Bryce said when we were back at my cottage, sitting across from me at the kitchen table. "Whatever you're thinking, I want to hear it." "Do you think I'm ridiculous?" I blurted out. "Being with you at my age?" His face softened. "Clarissa, do you think I'm ridiculous? Being with you at my age?" "No, but nothing. I'm an adult who knows what I want. So are you." He reached across the table for my hand. "The only opinions that matter here are yours and mine. And I think we're pretty spectacular together." 3 months into our relationship, the call came from Montana. The Wolverine project was moving forward, and they needed Bryce on location within the week. We'd known it was coming, had discussed the possibilities, but the reality of it still hit like a physical blow. 4 months, he reminded me as we lay in bed the night before his departure, my head on his chest, his heartbeat steady under my ear. "Maybe less if we get lucky with the footage. I'll call every day that I have signal. We'll do video chats when I'm back at base camp." "I know," I said, tracing patterns on his skin. "I'm not worried." It wasn't entirely true. Some small, insecure part of me wondered if this separation would be clarifying for him, if distance would make him realize he'd been caught up in a momentary infatuation, if he'd meet some young wildlife biologist on his crew and recognize her as a more suitable partner. "Liar," he said softly, lifting my chin so I had to meet his eyes. "Listen to me. This isn't a fling for me. This isn't some exotic experience I'm trying on for size. I love you, Clarissa McIntyre. I love your brilliant mind and your artist's hands and your quiet strength. I love how you arrange flowers to tell stories when words aren't enough. I love watching you garden in that ridiculous straw hat. I love your stubbornness and your independence and the way you look at the world. And none of that is going to change because we're apart for a few months." It was the first time he'd said those words, "I love you," though I'd felt them in 100 small gestures. Hearing them now, on the eve of our separation, broke something open inside me. "I love you too," I whispered, the words feeling both enormous and entirely inadequate. "And I'm going to miss you terribly." The months of his absence stretched longer than I could have imagined. I threw myself into summer at the shop, wedding season, our busiest time, creating arrangements for June brides and anniversary celebrations. I expanded our workshop offerings, teaching local children how to press wildflowers and make simple bouquets. I tended my garden obsessively, adding new varieties of clematis and experimenting with drought-resistant natives. True to his word, Bryce called whenever he could. Sometimes the connection was clear enough for video, and I could see the stunning Montana wilderness behind him, the exhaustion and exhilaration on his face as he described what they'd been filming. Other times, it was just his voice, crackling over satellite phone, a tenuous link across thousands of miles. He sent photos: a bull moose at dawn, fog rolling through alpine meadows, his tent pitched beside a mirror-still lake. I sent pictures too: new arrangements from the shop, Whitman sprawled dramatically across the piano keys, my garden in full summer bloom. In late August, he called with news that the shoot was wrapping up early. They'd captured the footage they needed, and he'd be home within the week. Home. The word hung between us, weighted with meaning neither of us had explored fully. His grandmother's small house had sold while he was away, the proceeds going to a conservation trust she'd specified in her will. His few belongings were in storage. Where was home exactly? "Your place," he said, when I cautiously raised the question. "If that's okay, just until I figure out next steps. I don't want to presume—" "Yes," I interrupted. "Yes, come home." The morning of his return, I was a bundle of nerves, checking and rechecking the fresh sheets on the bed, rearranging the flowers I'd placed in every room, convincing myself that 4 months apart might have changed everything between us. When his rental car finally pulled into my driveway, I forced myself to wait on the porch rather than running across the lawn like a lovesick teenager. He looked different, tanned almost mahogany from months outdoors, hair longer and pulled back in a small ponytail, leaner than when he'd left. For a heart-stopping moment, as he got out of the car, I was seized by doubt. He looked so young in the bright September sunlight, so vibrantly alive. What was he doing coming back to me, to my quiet life? Then he saw me, and his whole face transformed with joy. He covered the distance between us in long strides and swept me into an embrace that lifted me clean off the porch steps, spinning me in a circle that made me laugh like a girl. "God, I missed you," he murmured against my hair, setting me down but keeping me close. "I missed you every single day." And that night, after we'd relearned each other's bodies and lay tangled in my sheets, our sheets now, I supposed, he propped himself up on one elbow and studied my face in the moonlight streaming through the window. "I've been thinking," he said, a note in his voice making me pay close attention. "About? About home, about next steps." His free hand traced patterns on my bare shoulder. "I've been offered a position with a conservation group here in North Carolina, documenting the environmental impact of development in the Blue Ridge Mountains. It would mean being based here, with shorter trips into the field. Less money than the commercial work, but more stability. You'd be giving up the big projects," I said carefully. "The ones that take you to Alaska, to Montana. Are you sure that's what you want?" "I want a life with you," he said simply. "I want to wake up with you more often than not. I want to have a home base that doesn't fit in a backpack. I'm not giving up filming. I'm just shifting focus." I studied his face for any trace of resignation or sacrifice, finding only certainty. "Then yes," I said. "Move in, stay, build a life here." "Here specifically?" he asked, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Because I was thinking we might want a little more space eventually. Maybe a place with a bigger garden for you, a small studio for me. Something that would be ours together, not just me moving into your established life." The thought caught me by surprise. I'd been in my cottage for nearly 15 years, had planted every shrub and perennial in the garden, knew every creaky floorboard. But looking at Bryce in the gentle darkness, I could suddenly envision it. A new chapter, a shared creation. "I'd like that," I said. "I'd like that very much." And so here I am, watching dawn break over my garden one more time. This garden that has witnessed so much of my life. The moving trucks come tomorrow. We found a small farmhouse just outside Asheville. 3 acres with an apple orchard, space for an expanded garden, and a detached studio that Bryce is converting for his editing equipment. At 51, I'm starting over in ways I never imagined. There are still moments when doubt creeps in, when I catch a glimpse of us reflected in a store window and see the visible years between us, when I notice the glances from strangers trying to determine what our relationship could be. There are still difficult conversations with family members who don't understand, friends who worry I've lost my mind in some desperate bid to recapture youth. But then there are the other moments. Bryce teaching me to identify bird calls at dawn, the easy rhythm we've found in sharing space, the way he reads aloud to me from favorite books while I arrange flowers for the next day's orders. The deep, abiding joy of being truly seen and chosen by someone who could have chosen differently, but didn't. I don't know what the future holds for us. I'll be 60 when he's just entering his 40s. I'll be 70 when he's barely past 50. These facts haven't disappeared, but they've receded in importance, becoming just one aspect of a relationship built on so much more. Shared values, mutual respect, genuine delight in each other's company. And yes, a love I'd stopped believing was possible for me. The eastern sky is turning pink now, the first golden rays touching the tops of the trees. In a few hours, Bryce will wake up and join me out here with coffee, already talking about the native plants he wants to establish on our new property. We'll finish packing the last of the kitchen items, argue good-naturedly about whether my collection of antique vases deserves its own special box. It does. And prepare for tomorrow's transition. I run my fingers over the weathered arm of this porch swing one last time, grateful for all it has witnessed, ready now to leave it behind. The heart, I've discovered, has an infinite capacity for growth, for renewal, for late bloomings that prove to be the most vibrant of all. This love story of mine, unexpected, inconvenient, absolutely essential, isn't the one I thought I'd be living at this stage of my life. But standing at the threshold of this new chapter, I wouldn't trade it for any other.